My name is Ruby. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in offices where things run on deadlines, spreadsheets, and the quiet expectation that someone will always stay a little later than they should. I've been called a lot of things over the years: reliable, calm under pressure, the one who keeps everything together. But there's another way people tend to see someone like me. Not loud, not confrontational, not the kind of person who makes a scene. And in many workplaces, those qualities slowly turn into something else in other people's minds: invisible. I've never been the type to dominate meetings or compete for attention. I listen more than I speak. I notice details most people move past: the small inconsistencies in schedules, the way expectations quietly change without anyone formally saying they did. That habit, paying attention, is probably the only reason this story exists. Because what happened to me didn't begin with something dramatic. There was no big betrayal, no shouting match in a conference room, no moment where the entire office suddenly turned against me. It started with something much smaller: a phrase. My boss said I was not a team player for refusing to work 14-hour days. At first, that sentence didn't even sound strange in the environment we were working in. Long hours were treated like a badge of loyalty. People joked about sleeping under their desks. Midnight emails were praised. Apparently, dedication meant staying in the office until midnight. But one afternoon, while I was heating up leftover soup in the break room, I noticed something that had been there the entire time: a laminated labor law poster on the wall. It listed employee rights, overtime regulations, working hour protections, and it said something very different. Now, this isn't a story about revenge or humiliation or dramatic courtroom showdowns. What happened unfolded slowly, quietly, the same way most workplace dynamics do. It's a story about expectations, about silence, about the moment when you realize the role people assigned you was never one you agreed to play. And more importantly, what happens when you stop playing it? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't even announce what I was doing. But by the time people around me realized something had changed, it was already too late to put things back the way they were. So before I tell you the rest, I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where people assumed your silence meant you would accept anything? In most offices, there's a person who becomes the quiet center of gravity without anyone officially acknowledging it. At our company, that person was me. My job title was Operations Coordinator, which sounded far more administrative than it really was. In reality, I managed timelines across 4 different teams, handled vendor communications, tracked project compliance, and quietly fixed mistakes before they reached senior leadership. Most people didn't think much about the role itself. They thought about the results. Deadlines somehow stayed intact. Clients rarely escalated problems. Projects that looked chaotic somehow landed smoothly. When things worked, no one really wondered how, and I never went out of my way to explain. I arrived every morning around 8:30, not early enough to look performative, but early enough to get ahead of the day's problems. I made coffee in the small kitchen near the back hallway, the one most executives never used, and opened my Navy notebook. That notebook was my constant companion. While everyone else relied entirely on project software dashboards, I wrote things down by hand: conversations, promises made in meetings, small timeline shifts people forgot to mention. Over time, that habit became something like a quiet map of the entire company's workflow. Not that anyone noticed. To most of my coworkers, I was simply the reliable one, the person who didn't complain, the one who would stay late if a project was behind schedule. If someone missed a step in a process, I'd quietly adjust the timeline so it didn't become a public problem. If a vendor delayed delivery, I'd call them personally instead of forwarding the issue up the chain. I rarely asked for recognition, and because I didn't ask for it, it rarely came. At first, that never bothered me. I wasn't chasing promotions through office politics. I liked solving problems. I liked watching complicated systems work better because someone had paid attention to the small things. But slowly, over time, a different kind of reputation formed around me. Not the one I would have chosen. The Ruby will handle it reputation. If a project ran late, someone would say, Ruby will smooth it out. If documentation needs updating, Ruby usually takes care of that. If a team needed someone to stay after hours to make sure deliverables were submitted correctly, people would glance in my direction without even speaking, and most of the time, I would quietly nod. Not because I enjoyed working late, but because the alternative usually meant chaos for the next day's schedule. My manager at the time, Daniel, liked to describe me in performance reviews with the same phrase every year. Ruby is dependable. She doesn't create problems. At the time, I took that as a compliment. Dependability felt like stability. It meant I was trusted. It meant I had a place in the system. But what I didn't understand yet was how some workplaces interpret those qualities. Dependable can slowly become expected. Quiet can slowly become compliant, and when people begin to assume you will always absorb the pressure, they stop asking whether you should. I don't think anyone in the office consciously decided to treat me differently. That's the strange part about workplace dynamics. Most of them develop without anyone noticing. A few extra hours here, a quick favor there, an unspoken assumption that someone will always step in, until eventually that assumption becomes the role people see when they look at you. By the time the story really began, most of my coworkers believed they understood exactly who I was. The calm one, the reliable one, the one who would quietly stay until midnight if the team needed it. And for a long time, I let them believe that. Because back then, I hadn't yet realized how expensive that reputation would become. The first moment something felt wrong wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no formal warning, no confrontation that anyone else in the office would remember. In fact, if you asked most of my coworkers about that day, they probably wouldn't recall anything unusual at all. But I remember it clearly. It happened on a Thursday evening in early October, the kind of gray Seattle afternoon where the sky looks like it might rain but never quite does. Most of the office had already left by 6. I was finishing a vendor reconciliation report when Daniel stopped by my desk. Daniel was my manager, mid-40s, confident, the type of person who always seemed slightly impatient with quiet pauses in conversation. He liked efficiency, decisiveness, and people who matched his pace. In meetings, he often spoke about team commitment. At the time, I thought that meant collaboration. That evening, he leaned against the edge of my desk and glanced at my monitor. "Still here, Ruby?" he said. I nodded lightly. Just finishing the logistics reconciliation. It should be ready for tomorrow's review. He gave a quick approving smile, the kind managers give when something is going according to plan. Then he said something that seemed casual at the time. "Good. The team's been putting in some long hours lately. Everyone's really stepping up." I didn't think much of it. Long hours had been common for weeks because of a product rollout. I assumed he was acknowledging that. Then he added, almost offhandedly, "Honestly, the people who go the extra mile are the ones who show they're real team players." The sentence floated in the air for a moment, not directed at anyone specifically. Not exactly an instruction, just a statement. I remember nodding politely. At the time, I interpreted it as encouragement, a reminder that the project was important. Daniel walked away a few seconds later, already answering a message on his phone. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. But something about it stayed with me. Not because of what he said. Because of how it was said, there was a subtle expectation in the tone, a quiet assumption that long hours weren't temporary. They were a measure of loyalty. The next evening, a few people from the engineering team stayed until almost 10. Slack notifications kept appearing long after the official workday ended. Midnight commits, late night status updates. By Monday morning, those late hours had already turned into something else, a new baseline. During our weekly operations meeting, Daniel praised the engineers who had pushed through the weekend to keep momentum. People nodded around the table. No one questioned whether the timeline itself had been unrealistic. Instead, the conversation framed those extra hours as dedication, commitment, professional pride. I sat quietly near the end of the table, reviewing my notes. When the meeting ended, Daniel looked toward me. "Ruby, we might need operations support later this week if the rollout hits another delay." His tone was neutral, matter of fact. I nodded again. At that moment, nothing about the request seemed unreasonable. Projects have crunch periods. Teams help each other when deadlines get tight. That's normal. But later that afternoon, when I went to refill my coffee in the break room, I noticed something I had somehow never really read before. A laminated poster on the wall. Labor regulations, overtime guidelines, employee rights. It had probably been there for years. And for the first time, I actually stopped and read it. Not carefully yet, just enough to notice something small, something that quietly contradicted the culture developing around us. At the time, I didn't say anything about it, but that was the first moment a tiny question appeared in my mind, one that would slowly grow louder in the weeks ahead. The strange thing about workplace culture is that it rarely changes all at once. It shifts slowly. So slowly, in fact, that most people don't realize anything has changed at all. The weeks after that first conversation with Daniel followed the same rhythm as always. Morning stand-ups, project updates. The low hum of keyboards and quiet conversations drifts between cubicles, but something subtle had started to settle into the air. Late hours were no longer unusual. They were expected. At first, it appeared in small ways. A message at 7:30 p.m. asking if someone could quickly review a document. A Slack notification at 10:15 p.m. was tagged with urgent but quick. People started joking about it during the day. "Guess we're living here this month? Hope the coffee machine doesn't quit before we do." Everyone laughed. Humor is often the easiest way people normalize something uncomfortable. I noticed another pattern too. The people who stayed late received quiet recognition in meetings. Daniel would mention them casually. "Thanks to Mark for pushing through that fix late Friday night." "Shout out to Priya for staying until almost midnight to get the client patch ready." Each time he said it, the tone was approving, supportive, like those hours were proof of something admirable. Dedication, and slowly, almost without anyone noticing, that recognition began shaping behavior. People started sending messages later in the evening, even when the issue could easily wait until morning. Some stayed simply so they wouldn't look like the first person leaving. And somewhere in the middle of all that, my own role shifted a little too. It started with one request from Daniel late on a Wednesday. "Ruby, could you stay tonight and help coordinate the release checklist? Engineering's running behind." The request itself was reasonable. A delayed rollout often requires coordination across teams. Operations usually help stabilize those moments. So I stayed. 9:30 came, then 10. By the time we finished finalizing the documentation, the office floor was nearly empty. Daniel passed by my desk on his way out and gave a quick, approving nod. "Appreciate the extra effort," he said. Again, it sounded supportive, encouraging, but the following week, something similar happened again. Then again, the week after that. Each time the request came with the same calm assumption. "Ruby, could you stay late tonight?" "Ruby, can you help close out the deployment logs?" "Ruby, can you make sure compliance documentation is finalized before tomorrow morning?" And every time I quietly agreed. Not because I enjoyed being there at 11 o'clock at night, but because I understood how fragile some project timelines were. If the documentation wasn't correct, compliance could delay a release. If coordination failed, 3 teams might start blaming each other in the morning. Staying late often felt like the fastest way to prevent larger problems. At least that's what I told myself. What I didn't realize yet was that the pattern had already formed in everyone else's mind. Ruby stays. Ruby handles it. Ruby doesn't push back. There was another moment I remember clearly. One Friday afternoon, around 5:45, I started packing my bag to leave at a normal time. Across the room, one of the engineers glanced over and said half-jokingly, "Leaving early today, Ruby?" It wasn't meant to be cruel. His tone was casual, light, but I checked the clock, 5:46 p.m. Normal business hours had technically ended. Still, the comment lingered, because it revealed something important. Staying late had already become the standard. Leaving on time was now the unusual choice. That night, when I walked past the break room again, the same labor law poster caught my attention. This time, I read more of it. Overtime eligibility, maximum working hour guidelines, documentation requirements. The language was simple, clear, almost boring in its straightforwardness. But the more I read, the more a quiet realization began forming. Not anger, not frustration, just a calm, growing awareness. The culture around me was shifting further away from the rules printed on that wall, and nobody seemed to notice. Or maybe they noticed, but didn't think it mattered. At some point, every workplace quietly assigns people roles that have nothing to do with their job titles. Not official roles, unspoken ones. The funny thing is, those roles usually become visible only after they've already solidified. By the time I noticed mine, it had already been decided. I was the stabilizer, the person who absorbed the pressure when schedules slipped, the one who stayed late without making it into a negotiation. And because I rarely complained, that role fit neatly into everyone else's expectations. It showed up in small, almost polite ways. When deadlines tightened, Daniel would glance toward me before finishing a sentence. Operations will help close the gap. Operations, in practice, meant Ruby. If a team missed documentation, someone would forward the issue with a short note. "Ruby can probably fix this." Sometimes people didn't even ask. They simply assumed I would. At first, I tried to view it positively. It meant I was trusted. It meant people believed I could handle complicated problems. But trust and dependence can look almost identical from the outside. And when the balance shifts too far, one of them quietly turns into expectation. I began noticing it most clearly during evening hours. Around 6 o'clock, the office atmosphere would change. Some employees packed their bags quickly, apologizing as they left. Others lingered longer, sending one more message, finishing one more task. And then there were the few who had slowly become the late-night regulars. Engineers are debugging deployments, product managers reviewing last-minute updates, and me, coordinating the loose ends that kept everything connected. One night in particular stands out. It was close to 10:30 p.m. and the office floor had grown quiet in that hollow way buildings do after most people leave. The overhead lights dimmed slightly after 10. Cleaning staff moved through the hallways. The city outside the windows turns into scattered points of light. I was updating release documentation when Daniel walked past again. He paused, looked at my screen, then smiled. "You're always the last one standing," he said. It sounded like a compliment, the way someone might praise a marathon runner who never stops moving. But what struck me wasn't the words. It was how natural the statement felt to him, as if my presence at that hour was simply part of how things worked. Not a choice. A feature of the system. That was the moment something subtle clicked in my mind. I realized that my reliability had quietly become part of the company's infrastructure. People didn't ask whether I would stay late. They planned timelines, assuming I would. And the strange part was that no one had ever formally said this. There was no written expectation, no policy requiring those hours, just a growing cultural assumption. Ruby handles it. Ruby will stay. Ruby doesn't make things difficult. I began thinking about the labor law poster again, not in an emotional way, just analytically. Policies exist for a reason. They create boundaries when systems push too far. Yet, in our office, those boundaries had become almost invisible. Not because anyone had removed them, because no one was actively looking at them anymore, including me. For a long time, I had treated the late hours as temporary, part of a busy season, but by now the pattern had repeated for months, which meant something important. Temporary had quietly become normal, and normal had quietly become expected. I don't think Daniel ever intended to push anyone unfairly. From his perspective, the team was simply showing commitment. But what I was starting to realize was this: commitment is healthiest when it's voluntary. When it becomes assumed, something shifts. Something subtle but important, and that shift had already happened. The only question left was whether I would continue playing the role everyone had written for me, or whether at some point I would stop. I didn't know the answer yet. But the question had finally appeared. The moment things changed didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't happen in an argument, and it definitely didn't happen because someone crossed a dramatic line. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind of day that blends into every other workday when you look back later. That afternoon had already been long. A client integration had run into unexpected compatibility issues, which meant engineering was scrambling to patch something that should have been stable weeks earlier. By 6 o'clock, most of the office was still there. People were moving between desks, comparing notes, running quick tests. The energy in the room had that familiar late project intensity, a mix of determination and quiet fatigue. Around 7:15 p.m., Daniel walked over to my desk. I was reviewing compliance documentation, double-checking timestamps on a deployment checklist. He didn't sit down. He rarely did. He stood beside my desk, scanning the room as if measuring the atmosphere. "Looks like we're in for another late one," he said. I nodded politely. Engineering's still stabilizing the patch. Once they finalize it, we'll need operations to coordinate the release documentation. Then he added something that sounded casual, almost conversational. "You're good to stay tonight, right?" For a moment, I didn't answer. Not because the question was difficult, because something inside me paused. Up until that moment, I had never really examined the question itself. I had always answered automatically. Of course, sure, no problem. But this time something felt different. Maybe it was the quiet repetition of the pattern over the past months. Maybe it was the labor law poster I had read more carefully the night before. Or maybe it was simply fatigue, the kind that slowly erodes automatic compliance. I looked up at him and said calmly, "I can stay a little while, but I won't be able to stay until midnight." The sentence wasn't confrontational. My tone was the same calm tone I always used. Daniel blinked once, as if recalibrating. "Just tonight might run late," he said. "We're all pushing through." Again, the phrase appeared. We're all pushing through. I understood what he meant. Shared effort, team commitment, but I also understood something else now. The phrase wasn't really about teamwork. It was about alignment with the culture of staying. I closed my notebook slowly. "Then we should probably finalize the documentation earlier," I said. Still calm, still professional. Daniel looked at me for a moment longer. Then he gave a small shrug. "All right, just do what you can." And he walked away. The conversation lasted less than a minute. No tension, no raised voices. But as I sat there, something inside me had already shifted. Not anger, not rebellion, just clarity. For months, I had quietly adjusted my schedule around everyone else's expectations. I had absorbed the pressure because it seemed easier than disrupting the workflow. But in that brief exchange, I realized something simple. The system didn't run on late nights because they were necessary. It ran on late nights because enough people had agreed to them. Silently, automatically. And the moment even one person stopped agreeing without question, the entire assumption became visible. Around 8 o'clock that night, I finished the documentation I had promised. Engineering was still working through patch testing. A few people were ordering food to stay longer. At 8:20, I packed my bag. No announcement. No explanation. I walked past the break room on my way out. The same laminated labor law poster was still hanging on the wall. This time I didn't stop to read it. I already knew what it said. Instead, I walked out into the cool Seattle evening air. And for the first time in months, I left the office while the night still felt young. It was a small decision, quiet, but it changed something important, not just for that night, for everything that came after. The next morning, nothing dramatic happened. No meeting request appeared on my calendar. No email asking why I had left early. No quiet conversation with HR. If anything, the office looked exactly the same. People moved between desks with coffee cups in their hands. Slack notifications chimed in the background. Someone in marketing was laughing about a meme they had posted in the team channel. From the outside, nothing had changed. But something had changed. Just not in the way most people expect, because the shift didn't happen in the office. It happened in my mindset. For months, my silence had been automatic. I stayed late because it felt easier than questioning the pattern, easier than slowing down the momentum of a team already pushing forward. Now my silence became something different, a choice. That morning's stand-up meeting started at 9:15 as usual. Daniel reviewed the deployment from the night before. The patch had finally gone live around 11:40 p.m. A few engineers looked exhausted, but satisfied. "Good work pushing through," Daniel said. "We kept the release on schedule." Then he glanced toward me. Ruby helped finalize the documentation earlier in the evening. His tone was neutral, not praise, not criticism, just an acknowledgement that I had contributed. But I noticed something small. He didn't say Ruby stayed late with the team, because I hadn't. The meeting moved on quickly. New tasks, new timelines, another week of deliverables stacking quietly on the horizon. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk again, not confrontational, just curious. "You headed out around the usual time yesterday?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly. "Well, things may run late again this week with the integration fixes." I didn't respond immediately. Not out of hesitation, out of intention. Silence, I was realizing, can communicate just as much as words. Finally, I said calmly, "I'll make sure everything on the operations side is ready during working hours." Again, my tone stayed steady. No accusation, no challenge. Daniel studied me for a moment, as if trying to interpret whether that sentence carried some hidden meaning, but there wasn't one. It was simply a boundary stated without emotion. "All right," he said eventually. And that was the end of the conversation. But the real reactions didn't come from Daniel. They came from the rest of the team over the next few days. Subtle things at first. Someone was glancing at the clock when I started packing my bag at 6 o'clock. A quiet comment in the engineering Slack channel. "Anyone coordinating ops tonight?" Another engineer replying, "Ruby usually does." But that evening, I didn't stay. Not angrily, not as a statement. I simply left when the workday ended. The next morning, I arrived early again, like always. Coffee, notebook, review the timelines. From my perspective, nothing about my performance had changed. The work was still completed. Documentation was accurate. Coordination between teams remained smooth. The only difference was when I was doing it, during normal hours. And that subtle shift created a quiet confusion around me, because people had come to rely on something they had never formally requested. My extra time, my automatic agreement. Without it, the rhythm of the office felt slightly off. No one said it directly, but I could see the adjustment happening. Tasks that used to be casually pushed into the evening now had to be handled earlier. Questions that would normally appear at 9:30 p.m. had to be asked at 4:45. The system wasn't collapsing, it was simply recalibrating, but from the outside, some people interpreted my silence differently. To them, it looked like hesitation, or perhaps reluctance. One afternoon, I overheard a quiet conversation near the printer. "Ruby seems less flexible lately." The other voice replied softly, "Yeah, maybe she's just tired." I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct them, because the truth was simpler than either assumption. I wasn't tired, and I wasn't reluctant. For the first time since joining the company, I was simply choosing not to absorb every expectation placed in front of me. And the most interesting part, most people still believed that meant I was being passive, weak, quiet. They had no idea that silence had just become the most deliberate strategy I had ever used. The interesting thing about being underestimated is that it creates a kind of invisibility. Most people think invisibility is a disadvantage, but sometimes it's a form of freedom. Because when people assume you're passive, they stop paying attention to what you're actually doing. And that's exactly what began happening in the weeks after I stopped staying late. On the surface, nothing about my work changed. I still arrived early, I still coordinated the same projects, deadlines were still met, documentation still accurate, vendors still responding to the right timelines. From Daniel's perspective, operations were functioning normally. From my perspective, however, something new had begun. I started observing more carefully than ever before, not emotionally, not with the intention of catching someone doing something wrong, just methodically. My Navy notebook had always been a habit of mine, but now the way I used it became more precise. Every time a timeline changed, I wrote down the reason. Every time someone asked for work outside normal hours, I noted the request, dates, times, exact wording when possible, not in a suspicious way, just documentation. The kind any operations professional understands. But there was another layer I began paying attention to as well. Patterns. For example, I noticed that the majority of urgent late-night issues weren't actually emergencies. They were often the result of small planning gaps earlier in the week. A team is delaying a review, a product manager pushing a deadline forward without adjusting the workload, a last-minute feature request slipping into a release window. None of those decisions was malicious. They were simply convenient. And convenience often creates pressure somewhere else. In our case, that pressure had quietly been landing on whoever was willing to stay the latest, which, for months, had been me. But as I watched the workflow more closely, something else became clear. The system relied heavily on unrecorded effort. Late hours, off-the-clock coordination, messages answered long after the workday technically ended. None of those things appeared in project documentation. None of them appeared in official reports. Yet they were holding the entire schedule together. Once I noticed that pattern, my curiosity shifted towards something more practical. How much of our timeline actually depended on those invisible hours? To answer that question, I started reviewing our official processes more closely. Release checklists, compliance guidelines, operations documentation. The company had detailed policies about almost everything: approval procedures, data security, vendor contracts. But when it came to working hours and workload expectations, the policies were surprisingly vague, which led me back to the labor law poster in the break room. One morning, before most people arrived, I walked in with my coffee and read it again. This time slowly. The language was simple. Employers must track overtime hours for eligible employees. Extended working hours require appropriate compensation. Work schedules must comply with federal labor regulations. Nothing dramatic, nothing complicated, just standard employment law. But the more I compared those rules with the culture in our office, the more something quietly interesting emerged. The system worked partly because nobody was measuring the extra hours, not accurately. People stayed late because it was expected, but those hours were rarely documented as formal overtime. They simply became part of the culture, which meant something important. If someone ever decided to document those hours properly, the numbers might tell a very different story. That realization didn't make me angry. If anything, it made me calmer, because I wasn't looking for conflict. I was looking for clarity. So I continued doing exactly what I had always done. I observed, I documented, and I learned. Over the next few weeks, my notebook slowly filled with quiet details most people never noticed. Who asked for late-night support? How often did those requests appear? Which teams depended on last-minute coordination? And how frequently the timeline issues could have been solved during normal hours with slightly different planning. No one paid attention to my notebook. Why would they? From the outside, I was still the same Ruby. Quiet, reliable, calm. But behind that calm routine, something else had begun forming. Not a plan, not yet. Just a growing understanding of how the entire system actually worked. And more importantly, where its weakest assumptions lived. Up until that point, everything I had been doing was observation, watching patterns, recording details, understanding how the system actually functions beneath the surface. But the moment of real clarity came quietly one afternoon, almost by accident. It was a Wednesday, and most of the office had left for lunch. I had stayed behind to finish reviewing a compliance document related to our vendor operations. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the HVAC system. While cross-checking documentation, I opened a folder that contained archived project schedules from earlier in the year. I wasn't looking for anything unusual, just verifying timeline references. But as I compared those schedules with the notes in my notebook, something interesting started to emerge. A pattern. Several of the most stressful project launches, the ones that had required teams to stay until midnight or later, had one thing in common. The official project schedules showed normal timelines. Nothing extreme, nothing that should have required such heavy late-night work, which meant the pressure hadn't been part of the formal plan. It had appeared later. Small adjustments, feature additions, last-minute approvals, tiny shifts that seemed harmless when they happened individually, but when they stacked together, the timeline compressed. And when that compression happened, the solution had always been the same. Stay later, push harder, absorb the pressure quietly. The more I examined those schedules, the clearer something became. The company didn't technically require excessive hours, but the workflow produced them indirectly. Deadlines were moved without adjusting workloads. Tasks were added without extending timelines. People filled the gap by working longer. And because those hours were rarely tracked in any structured way, the system kept repeating itself. It wasn't malicious. It was simply invisible. I leaned back in my chair and looked at my notebook. Dates fill several pages now. Notes about late-night coordination, messages requesting help outside working hours. Moments where projects had quietly slipped beyond normal limits. Individually, none of those entries meant very much, but together they formed something more concrete, a record. Not emotional, not exaggerated, just factual. And that was when the realization settled in. For months, I had been documenting something most people around me weren't even aware of, a timeline of invisible labor. The hours that kept projects afloat but never appeared in official reports. I didn't feel triumphant when that realization arrived. If anything, I felt a kind of calm seriousness, because documentation changes things, not immediately, but eventually. It transforms vague assumptions into measurable facts. And facts have a way of reshaping conversations. For a long time, the office culture had been built on a simple belief: everyone just works a little extra when needed. No big deal. But what I was beginning to see was that a little extra had quietly accumulated into something much larger. Something that, if presented clearly, would raise uncomfortable questions. Questions about overtime tracking. Questions about workload planning. Questions about whether the company's actual practices aligned with its formal policies. I closed the folder on my computer and sat there for a moment. This wasn't leverage in the dramatic sense. No secret scandal, no shocking discovery. Just information. Accurate, consistent, documented, and sometimes that's more powerful than anything else. Because systems rarely collapse under emotion, they respond to evidence. Still, I wasn't rushing to do anything with it. That's the part people often misunderstand about situations like this. Discovery doesn't always create urgency. Sometimes it creates patience. Because once you understand the structure of a system, you realize something important. You don't need to act quickly. You only need to act carefully. So I closed my notebook, finished the compliance document I had originally been working on, and returned to the normal rhythm of the afternoon. Emails, vendor confirmations, timeline updates. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, something had become very clear. For the first time since this entire situation began, I understood exactly where the quiet imbalance in our workplace actually lived. And once you see that kind of imbalance clearly, you can't really unsee it. Understanding something and deciding what to do about it are two very different moments. The discovery itself had been quiet, almost clinical. A realization that the system around me depended on something most people never measured. But the real question came afterward. What should I do with that understanding? For several days, I didn't make any decisions at all. I simply continued working the way I always had. Morning coffee, notebook open, emails, timelines, vendor confirmations. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside my mind, however, I was considering possibilities. There were several obvious options. The first was confrontation. I could schedule a meeting with Daniel and explain what I had been noticing, show him the patterns, suggest that the company needed better overtime tracking and more realistic scheduling. But I knew how that conversation would likely go. Not badly, just defensively. Because when systems are questioned, people often hear criticism rather than information. Daniel would probably say the team was doing its best under tight deadlines. He might promise to look into it. And then slowly, the conversation would disappear into the background noise of daily work. The second option was escalation. I could go directly to HR, present the documentation, raise formal concerns about working hours and labor compliance. That approach had a different risk. Escalations tend to create tension quickly. Even if the concerns are valid, the process often becomes adversarial. And I wasn't interested in becoming the center of a workplace conflict. There was also a third option, the one most people choose. Do nothing. Continue absorbing the late hours quietly. Accept that some workplaces simply function that way. Plenty of people around me had already made that choice. They stayed late when necessary. They joked about exhaustion. They treated midnight Slack messages as part of the job. For a few days, I seriously considered following that path. After all, the situation wasn't unbearable, just unfair in a subtle way. But every time I thought about returning to that pattern, I remembered something simple. Boundaries don't reappear once they've disappeared. If you allow expectations to grow unchecked, they rarely shrink again on their own. So eventually, I realized the real decision wasn't between confrontation and silence. It was between reaction and structure. Reacting would mean responding emotionally to what had already happened. Structure would mean quietly reshaping how the situation functioned going forward. And that realization led me to a different conclusion. Instead of arguing about the system, I would simply start operating within the rules that already existed. The same rules are written on that laminated poster in the break room. Federal labor regulations, overtime documentation, working hour limits, policies the company technically already followed, at least on paper. The more I thought about it, the clearer the path became. No confrontation required, no accusations, just accuracy. If work extended beyond normal hours, those hours would be recorded properly. If coordination happened late at night, it would be documented the same way as daytime work was documented. Nothing dramatic, nothing rebellious, just transparent. And transparency has an interesting effect on systems built around invisible effort. It forces them to acknowledge what they previously ignored. The decision itself didn't feel bold. It felt inevitable. Because once I understood the structure of the imbalance, pretending not to see it anymore wasn't really an option. Still, I didn't announce anything. No email, no speech, no warning. The most effective changes rarely arrive with an announcement. They begin quietly. Small adjustments, new habits, subtle shifts in how things are recorded and communicated. From the outside, it would simply look like Ruby continuing to do her job. But from that point forward, something important would be different. Every extra hour, every late-night request, every moment when the system stretched beyond its official limits would finally become visible. And once visibility enters a system that depends on invisibility, the consequences tend to arrive on their own. The change didn't begin with a meeting. There was no announcement, no memo, no message in the company's Slack channel explaining that something new was happening. From the outside, everything about my work looked exactly the same. I still arrived early, still carried my Navy notebook, still coordinated the same projects and answered the same questions. But behind those routines, a new habit had quietly started. Documentation. Not dramatic documentation, just precise. When a request arrived after normal working hours, I logged the time the message appeared. When I responded to a late-night coordination issue, I noted when the task began and when it ended. If a project deadline shifted suddenly and required extra evening work, I recorded the timeline adjustment. Nothing emotional, no commentary, just facts. At first, these notes stayed inside my notebook, but gradually I began transferring them into the official systems we already used. Timesheets, project coordination logs, release documentation. Most companies already have tools designed to track labor hours accurately. In our office, those tools had existed for years. They just hadn't been used very carefully. For months, people had simply written down their standard 8-hour days, regardless of what actually happened. Late nights were treated as informal contributions, part of team effort. But once I began recording my hours precisely, something subtle changed. For the first time, the system reflected the real timeline of the work. One evening, a deployment issue appeared at 9:10 p.m. Normally, I would have quietly coordinated with engineering and finished the documentation without thinking much about it. This time, I did exactly the same thing. I helped coordinate the update, confirmed the compliance checklist, verified the vendor communication. But when the work finished at 10:02 p.m., I logged the full period in the official system. Not exaggerated, not rounded, just accurate. The next morning, when I submitted my timesheet, the entry was simple. 9:10 p.m. to 10:02 p.m., deployment coordination support. That was it. No explanation attached. No complaint, just a line item that reflected what had actually happened. For the first few days, nobody noticed. Why would they? Most people barely glanced at the timesheet details unless something unusual appeared. But over the next 2 weeks, those entries slowly accumulated. Late evening coordination. Weekend document reviews. After hours vendor confirmations. All tasks that had previously existed only in Slack messages and quiet favors, now they existed in the company's formal record. And formal records have a way of traveling upward through systems. First to payroll, then to department budgeting. Eventually, to management oversight. I didn't rush the process. There was no need. I simply continued working exactly as I always had. If something needed to be done during normal hours, I handled it then. If someone asked for help late at night, I responded when appropriate and logged the time accurately. Most of the team didn't notice the shift, but the system did. Within a month, something interesting began to happen. Operations hours were appearing slightly higher than usual in internal reports. Nothing alarming, just noticeable. At first, it looked like a temporary fluctuation, a busy period. But as the weeks continued, the numbers stayed consistent because the late-night work had always been there. It simply hadn't been visible before. One afternoon, while reviewing a vendor contract summary, I received a short message from the finance department. "Hi, Ruby. Quick clarification on some after-hours entries in your timesheets. Just confirming these are accurate?" I read the message once, then replied with a single sentence. "Yes, those hours reflect coordination tasks completed outside normal business hours." A few minutes later, the finance representative responded, "Thanks for confirming." That was all. No concern. No investigation. Just acknowledgement. But systems don't need dramatic reactions to start adjusting. They only need accurate information. And once accurate information begins moving through a structure built on assumptions, the structure slowly begins to shift, even if most of the people inside it haven't realized why yet. The first signs of change were so subtle that most people didn't connect them to anything specific. At first, they appeared as small adjustments in conversation. During one weekly operations meeting, Daniel paused while reviewing department reports. "Looks like operations logged more overtime hours than usual this month," he said casually. He didn't sound concerned, just mildly curious. I sat at the table reviewing my notes, listening without reacting. Someone from the product asked, "Was there a major rollout?" And Daniel glanced down the report again. "Not really, just some coordination work happening later in the evenings." He moved on quickly to the next topic, but something interesting had happened. For the first time, the extra hours had become visible in the numbers. Before, late-night coordination existed only as quiet favors between teams. Now it existed in the system, and systems respond to numbers. A week later, another subtle shift appeared. During a planning session for an upcoming release, Daniel said something I hadn't heard before. "Let's try to avoid late-night coordination if possible. Finance has been asking questions about overtime tracking." The room stayed quiet for a moment. Not tense, just thoughtful. One engineer said, "Maybe we should finalize the testing earlier in the day then." Another nodded. "Yeah, that would help." It wasn't a dramatic policy change. No new rule was announced. But the tone had shifted slightly. Late nights were no longer automatically assumed. They were something to be avoided when possible. Over the next couple of weeks, I noticed more small adjustments. People started asking operational questions earlier in the afternoon instead of late in the evening. Deployment checklists were reviewed before 5 instead of after 8. A few engineers even began scheduling brief coordination calls during the day to prevent last-minute issues. None of these changes was dramatic, but together they created a different rhythm. The office still worked hard, deadlines still existed, but the invisible expectation of midnight problem-solving began fading quietly. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk again. He looked thoughtful. "Ruby," he said, "you've been logging hours pretty precisely lately." "Yes," I replied calmly. He nodded slowly. "That's probably a good habit." Then he walked away, No criticism, no confrontation, just acknowledgement. And that was when I realized something important. I hadn't forced the system to change. I had simply shown it what it was already doing. And once that reality appeared clearly in the records, the system had begun correcting itself. The real tension didn't appear immediately. For a while, everything simply adjusted. Meetings shifted earlier, questions were asked sooner in the day, a few late-night deployments were rescheduled to the afternoon instead. From the outside, it looked like the company was simply improving its planning, but behind the scenes, something else had started happening. Finance had begun reviewing departmental labor reports more closely. Not because of a complaint, just because the numbers had changed. Operations hours had become more detailed, more precise, and slightly higher than before, which meant someone eventually asked a reasonable question. Were these hours new, or had they always existed? That question slowly moved upward through management. One afternoon, Daniel called a short team meeting. Nothing dramatic, just 10 minutes in the conference room. He looked a little more serious than usual. Finance is reviewing overtime reporting across departments, he said. Apparently, our recent entries flagged some inconsistencies in how hours were logged earlier this year. No one spoke for a moment, because everyone in the room understood something quietly. The late nights hadn't suddenly appeared. They had simply become recorded. Daniel continued. They're asking us to make sure project timelines stay within normal working hours whenever possible. Again, the message sounded reasonable, professional. But there was something else underneath it. A subtle realization spreads through the room. For months, maybe longer, the system had depended on invisible labor. Now that those hours were visible, the company had to account for them. And once something enters official records, it's very difficult to return to pretending it wasn't there before. After the meeting ended, a few coworkers lingered near the door. One of the engineers said quietly, "Guess we can't just push everything into the evening anymore." Another replied with a small laugh, "Probably for the best." No one sounded angry, just aware. The strange thing about systems is that once visibility appears, old habits can't fully return. Because now there are reports, budgets, questions. And even if no one blamed anyone directly, the culture of endless late nights had already started unraveling, not dramatically, just gradually. And by the time people fully realized why things were changing, the numbers had already made the old system impossible to ignore. The conversation with Daniel happened a few days after that meeting. He didn't schedule it as a formal review. He simply stopped by my desk late in the afternoon when the office had grown quieter. "Ruby, do you have a minute?" he asked. I nodded and turned my chair slightly toward him. Daniel leaned against the edge of the desk, holding a tablet with a few reports open on the screen. "I've been looking at the overtime entries from the last couple of months," he said. His tone wasn't sharp. If anything, it sounded reflective. Finance is asking why operations hours look different now compared to earlier this year. I listened without interrupting. Then I said calmly, "The entries reflect the hours the coordination work actually took." He nodded slowly, scrolling through something on the tablet. Before, those hours weren't really logged this way. "That's true," I replied. There was a short silence, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Daniel finally looked up at me. "You're not doing anything wrong," he said. "Just to be clear." "I'm aware," I said quietly. Another pause followed, then he sighed lightly. Not out of frustration, more like someone recognizing a situation that had already moved past the point of easy adjustment. "I guess we got used to people just staying late when needed," he admitted. "That happens in a lot of places," I said. He studied me for a moment. "You didn't raise an issue with anyone," he said. "You just started logging the hours." "Yes." Why? The question didn't sound accusatory, just curious. I answered honestly, because the work was real. Daniel held my gaze for a second, then nodded again. That's fair. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a quiet understanding settling between us. The system had relied on something unspoken for a long time, and now that it had finally been spoken, not loudly but clearly, there wasn't much left to debate. Daniel closed the report on his tablet. Well, he said, we'll adjust the planning going forward. Then he walked back toward his office. And that was the entire confrontation, calm, brief, almost uneventful, but sometimes the most important conversations are the ones where no one needs to win, because the facts have already settled the matter. Not much changed about my daily routine after that conversation. I still arrived around the same time every morning, still made coffee in the quiet kitchen near the back hallway, still opened my Navy notebook before checking emails. From the outside, I was the same person everyone had always known. Ruby, calm, reliable, quiet. But internally, something had shifted in a way that felt permanent. For a long time, I had believed that being dependable meant quietly accepting whatever the system required. Stay later, fix the problem, keep everything moving. And for a while, that approach worked. But somewhere along the way, dependability had slowly turned into something else. Expectation. And expectations grow very easily when no one ever pauses to examine them. What I learned from the entire experience wasn't how to challenge people, it was about how to understand systems. Most workplace pressure isn't created by bad intentions. It grows out of habits, convenient shortcuts, assumptions that slowly become normal. The strange thing is that once those habits become visible, they often correct themselves. Not immediately, but gradually. Over the next few months, our project timelines became slightly more realistic. Late-night coordination still happened occasionally. That's normal in any busy environment. But it was no longer treated as the default solution. More importantly, the responsibility for managing those timelines became shared across teams, not quietly absorbed by whoever stayed the latest. Daniel and I continued working together professionally. There was no lingering tension between us. If anything, our communication became clearer. Because once boundaries exist, conversations tend to become simpler. I didn't become louder. I didn't become confrontational. And I didn't stop being reliable. The only thing that truly changed was this. I stopped believing that reliability required silence. Sometimes the most professional thing you can do isn't work harder. It's making sure the work itself is being seen clearly. And once that happens, people begin adjusting their expectations on their own. Not because they were forced to, but because the reality in front of them finally matches the story they've been telling themselves. Looking back now, the entire situation feels quieter than most people expect when they hear the story. There was no dramatic fallout, no angry resignation, no moment where anyone stood in the middle of the office and declared that something had been unfair. Instead, everything unfolded slowly. One small boundary, one simple habit of recording the work as it actually happened. One system gradually adjusted once it could finally see the full picture. And that's probably the biggest lesson I carried away from it. Most workplace problems don't explode because of bad people. They grow quietly through assumptions. Someone stays late once to help the team. Then it happens again. Then it becomes normal. Eventually, no one even notices that the expectation has grown larger than it was ever meant to be. What changed my situation wasn't confrontation. It was visibility. When effort becomes visible, systems naturally start correcting themselves. Budgets change. Planning improves. Responsibilities are spread more evenly, not perfectly, but more honestly. Today, I'm still the same kind of person I've always been. I pay attention to details, I document things carefully, and I try to keep systems running smoothly. The only difference is that now I understand something important. Quiet people aren't powerless. Sometimes they're simply the ones who see the system most clearly. So I'm curious about your experience. Have you ever been in a workplace where staying late slowly became an unspoken expectation? And if so, how did you handle it?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.